parable of the tenants. Luke chapter 20, verses 9 to 19. He went on to tell people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. At harvest time he sent a servant to the tenants, so they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that one also they beat and treated him shamefully, and sent away empty-handed. He sent still a third, and they wounded him and threw him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my son whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. "This is the heir," they said. "Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When the people heard this, they said, "May this never be." Jesus looked directly at them and asked, "Then what is the meaning of that is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed." The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately, because they knew he had spoken this parable against them, but they were afraid of the people.
Okay, well, we're looking now at the tenants in the vineyard. This is our final in the series of 7 in 7, Jesus the Greatest Teacher, looking at the 7 parables in Luke's Gospel. So, tenants in the vineyard, Luke 20:9 to 19. Now, the context of this parable is the issue of authority. As always, when we look at any Bible passage, it's always a good kind of technique to say what has preceded it in the order of the text and what follows it. That helps us to give a kind of context. And here, what has preceded this story of the tenants is the authority of Jesus has been questioned. And in verse 8 of Luke 20, just before this reading, Jesus said, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." So he is challenging some of the Jewish leaders about the issue of authority. So this parable deals with the issue of authority. Now, a key aspect of being a disciple of Jesus is that we say Jesus is Lord of our lives. And it's very easy to say that, but to live it out is much, much more of a challenge. So to say Jesus is Lord is that we're really saying Jesus has authority to guide and direct our lives. We want to make his priorities our priorities for our lives. And we live in an age where authority is often questioned, perhaps more so than at any point in recent history. Certainly going back perhaps to the 1960s, we see the breakdown of many of traditional pictures of authority. Many trusted groups have become less trusted due to all sorts of issues. Now, we see there's a real danger when we lose a sense of having authority in our lives, but sometimes to break free from false authority is a really good thing. There can be a false deference as well as a legitimate authority. So how do we respond to authority seems to be a really important issue. And if we claim that Jesus is Lord, is there evidence of his authority in our lives? Now, in the life of the early church, there was 2 areas where the lordship of Jesus had particular kind of connection points. So the New Testament church is trying to work out, if Jesus is Lord, what is the authority of the Torah, the Jewish law, upon my life? How do I engage with the revelation of God's law in the scriptures? How do I apply that to my discipleship of Jesus? So that's a really big discussion. The other big area of authority is, how do I respond to being part of the Roman Empire? How does the authority of Caesar and the Roman culture and the Greek culture, how does that impact upon my discipleship? What can I accept? What do I have to resist and reject? So those are really big issues. And if you look at so many of the New Testament letters, they are really dealing with that. How do I live a holy life in this context of Torah and the Roman Empire? But this particular parable is told against the teachers of the law. many of whom, not all of them, but many of whom refused to accept the authority of Jesus. And I think this parable is sort of an allegorical setting of Jesus' relationship with many of the Jewish leaders. So the story continues. A man planted a vineyard. I think there's a link to Isaiah 5 if you want to go and make that little focus in Isaiah 5. But a man planted a vineyard and he worked hard, but he left the vineyard. He was an absent landlord, and he sent a servant each year to collect the share of his investment of his vineyard. But as you know from the story, the servants were beaten up and rejected. Now again, in many interpretators, that the servants represent the prophets who came to speak God's word before the coming of Jesus. So if you look at the book of Hebrews, I'm just going to quote Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1-2. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. So some people say that that order of the book of Hebrews, the prophets and then the Son, is kind of echoed in this parable. The servants come, and then the owner of the vineyard sends his own son. I will send my son, whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him. In verse 13, we have those words. So that's really the climax of this story. The son is coming. Surely he is going to be respected. But we see what happens, that the son is not respected. They kill him. So they threw him out of the vineyard and they killed him, verse 15. And I think that as Jesus tells this story, I think it shows that Jesus is aware that in a short period of time, he would face the horrors of crucifixion. He knew that that rejection was going to come for him as well. Now, some people suggest that this is a parable which can be used to support a teaching called replacement theology. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term, but in the church, many people have a theology called replacement, and they see that God has turned his back upon the Jewish people because they have been unfaithful to God, they've rejected God, and the promises of Israel have been replaced or transferred to the church. And I believe that the replacement theology is actually a very bad theology to have. In many ways, it has elements of heresy, and sometimes replacement theology can lead to anti-Semitism, with something which is very, very evil. Now, if you're not sure about this replacement theology stuff, I've got a couple of books which may just help you look at this. The first book is by a friend of CMJ, Thomas Fretwell, and it's a really good introduction. It says, the book is called Why the Jewish People? Understanding Replacement Theology and Anti-Semitism. I think this is an excellent book and a really good book to start if you want to dig into some of these issues. A really, really good introduction by Thomas Fretwell. And my own little book here, The Case for Enlargement Theology, perhaps goes a little bit deeper. And if you want to go a bit deeper, this book may be a really good follow-up to the book by Thomas Fretwell. So some people feel that this parable really is that God has rejected Jewish people, rejected Israel, and is now working in a new context. And some people say that this is borne out in the book of Acts. For example, if you go to Acts 18, verse 6, it talks about Paul, being rejected by some of the Jewish people, and then he says, I'm going out now to the Gentiles. So that kind of buys in some people's minds, to a replacement motif in terms of theology. But actually, if you look carefully at the book of Acts, for example, Paul does at times focus on the Gentile communities, yet he never teaches that God has abandoned Israel. In fact, he teaches the exact opposite. If you read in Romans 9, 10 and 11, you see how Paul is convinced about God's ongoing commitment and faithfulness to Israel. And at the end of the book of Acts, Paul is actually speaking to Jewish leaders in Rome about the gospel. Now, clearly there is judgment on some of the Jewish leaders who did not accept Jesus, but this is never judgment on the whole group. Some Jewish leaders, many Jewish leaders, in fact, did receive Jesus. Again, if you look in Acts chapter 21, verse 20, we're told that there were thousands of Jewish people who said yes to Jesus, many of whom were fully Torah observant. So often I think we see in the New Testament a focus on the Jewish no to Jesus, but there's also a very strong Jewish yes to Jesus. And of course, two of Jesus' own brothers, James and Jude, became leaders of the church. And of course, the church grew in a Jewish context as well as in a Gentile context. So I believe God remains faithful to Israel. And we need to be very careful of having some kind of replacement theology, which I think is damaging to our purposes as Christians. It's clearly at the ministry of churches, ministry among Jewish people, we want to make sure we have the right attitude to Jewish people. That's very much part of our ministry. So we reject a replacement interpretation of this parable and a wider replacement theology. So how then do we apply this? I suppose for me, a couple of questions as we finish. How is Jesus' authority shown in my life? Is there evidence that Jesus is Lord of my life? Or am I just paying some kind of lip service to him? And also the tenants here, they sought ownership of the vineyard. If they could reject the father and kill the son, they would own the vineyard. And sometimes I think as Christians, we have a tendency to want to own our own spiritual gifts. You know, we say, these are my gifts. And we sometimes wear spiritual gifts as medals when they should really be tools of service. And we often talk about my church or my ministry. And again, sometimes we hold very tightly to things which really we have no right to hold to. These are gifts. These are God's graces. This is God's work. I'm always very encouraged when one of the trustees I work with within CMJ, he often says when he's praying at a trustees meeting, he says, Lord, we are simply temporary custodians of your work. This is your work. We are just temporary custodians. We do not own this. So let's have a right attitude to what God has given us. Let us be servants or custodians, but we're never owners. And above all, we want to say, Jesus, you are Lord, and you have authority in my life. And maybe all these parables, at the end of the day, are showing us what it means to follow Jesus and to put him first and to seek his kingdom. And if we do that, then these parables will continue to speak into our lives and they'll give us hope and encouragement and insight. So thanks for listening to this little series, 7 in 7. I hope there's something there for you, and thank you again for listening.